With a relatively modest budget, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon went on to become the highest-grossing foreign-language film in U.S. history, even as it found more audiences worldwide. In this lively conversation, screenwriter and producer James Schamus gets to the heart of the film's unprecedented success and discusses his long-standing relationship and artistic collaboration with Ang Lee.
So you and Ang Lee have worked together for a really long time, but he'd never done a movie like this before. As a producer, how do you sell people on a movie, a martial arts movie by someone who's never directed a martial arts movie?
Yeah, well, there are two responses to your question. Number one is awfully true that we've worked a long time together. So it's, but at the same time, every film is brand new. He doesn't stick to a genre per se. You know, we always are looking for something that's going to be a challenge and that's different. So Ang's career is one that's very hard to pigeonhole, simply because he doesn't really look back that much. So the biggest challenge in getting the financing for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was not that Ang was new to the genre, but that the genre at that time was considered worn out, more or less defunct, and a straight-to-video type of proposition. Those movies just hadn't been functioning well for a long time, and the tropes and conventions and kind of audience that was assumed waiting for it had gotten a little stale. So the hardest part was letting people know that we had a take on the genre that we thought could really reach an audience that wasn't necessarily pigeonholed as whatever audience was left for the chop-socky genre. That was the tough part. Otherwise, it's always hard selling Ang.
I assume calling it the chop-socky genre was one of the things you didn't do in order to market it.
Yeah, that would be one of them. You know, it's funny because we had a number of pitches. You know, one was, well, it's kind of like Sense and Sensibility, but with martial arts, you know, this kind of thing. None of them worked all that well, in fact. We had a high net worth individual from Taiwan who had made the commitment to finance the picture, and then a couple of weeks into our pre-production, decided to change his phone number, more or less, and became just unavailable for return calls. Huh. And at that point, it was a pretty epic scramble on the part of Ang's team to pull together the financing. We were very lucky to have fans at Sony Pictures Classics. And it was an extraordinarily complicated financing. It was kind of epic. And all the while, we had our crew sitting in Beijing, not sitting, running and standing and doing jumping jacks every morning together. And Bill Kong, our producer in Hong Kong, was able to patch together enough financing to keep us alive while we got the rest of the movie together.
I mean, between that and the Taiwanese dropout and Michelle Yeoh's injury, like, how many times were there during the course of this that it looked like the film really wasn't going to happen?
Well, in general, one woke up in the morning assuming the worst, and more or less for every morning of the pre-production and production of the film, that was pretty much what happened. We had everything from Michelle Yeoh's injury right at the very beginning of the show to just the kind of stuff that you don't think about when you think about putting movies together, like being out near the Gobi Desert and all the drivers getting lost in a sandstorm and nobody showing up at the hotel for 2 days. Stuff like that. You know, it was really kind of rock and roll the whole time, but we had an amazing crew, and they stuck with it. You know, we did it for a nickel by comparison with what movies of this kind usually cost, and probably should cost, frankly.
The editor, Tim Squires, when we talked, said that there was pretty much no studio overview of the edit because the turnaround was so fast. What about in pre-production? Did they have input into the script? Was there anything they wanted from you?
No, the great thing was, as filmmakers, we had two things going for us as a result of the difficulty of financing the picture. We had 10 or 15 financing partners, and therefore not one was really a definitive voice, so that allowed us the freedom to do as we would. And the second was our major partner, which was the folks at Sony Pictures Classics. That team had so much faith in Ang and in the project, and such a great attitude about it, that once they understood what we were up to, really it was just building out towards the release. I mean, we were working with them on conceptualizing how we were going to sell a movie that was unlike any other that was going to be introduced in the marketplace in that way for years and years and years, really from day one.
I understand that your script, just for the fight sequences, just said they fight it's the greatest fight sequence in history ever. Was that part of that selling process? How did people react to that?
Yeah, I find that, and I've written on some pretty big Hollywood action movies. As a screenwriter, I've gotten hired, and sometimes you get credit, sometimes you don't, but you do get paid, so that's good. I'm not complaining. On some pretty major action films. And I have found that in a lot of those screenplays, when the writers try to detail in exquisite, minute specifics the ins and outs of the fight sequences, that you just kind of like, it's a big yawn. It's a visual medium. Pre-visualizing, giving pointers, all that kind of stuff, really is the nature of the creative process. You can come up with ideas about what leads into a fight and some of the main, I would say, themes of a fight, and that's what we did in the screenwriting process. We treated every fight in two ways. We treated each fight as a kind of musical number. We knew that the film was essentially, in a way, if there was a genre for it that wasn't chopsaki, it was the musical. You know, people talk and then they get emotional, and the minute they get emotional, they start singing and dancing, whereas in our movie, they don't sing and dance, they just start trying to kill each other. But so that was number one. And number two, we treated every fight as if it carried forward the narrative in some way. So you didn't stop the story so that people could stop and fight. You extended the story through the fight. And so each fight has its own logic: audio, visual, narrative, emotional, and in terms of all those things coming together, it carries forward the movie. It just doesn't stop the movie. And we had one more thing going for us. We had a guy named Wen Wo-ping as our martial arts coordinator and choreographer. And he, of course, was a partner for Ang in the process of putting those fights together. It was a admittedly, sometimes contentious partnership, but those are sometimes the best kind.
What did you witness of that? Like, what was the contention?
The contention really had to do with the fact that I don't think that in the system as we had inherited it in Asia for martial arts movies, the director really often didn't have that much to say about the fights. And Ang is not a director who goes, you know what, I'm going off to lunch, you guys do the fight thing, let me see how it goes. And also, because of our approach to the fights, we really wanted to break the mold, so to speak, in terms of the use of the traditions. We didn't want to destroy those traditions, and we didn't want to say that we were smarter or better than they, but we did want to say there was a way in which to engage people in the process by which characters really do take flight. They really do connect through their fighting in a different way.
I understand there's a little contention between you and Ang as well, just where you felt that your writing style, and I understand he wanted the dialogue to sound like a King Hu film. Like, how did that work out? How did the two of you manage your expectations?
You know, it wasn't really a clash. It was me throwing myself into a vast sea of ignorance. I don't have the background in the culture. I don't have the language. And Ang is known here in the West as a visual stylist, as a great filmmaker. But I've learned over the quarter of a century or more that I've worked side by side with Ang and gotten to know him in the Chinese context, that he is actually an exquisitely finely attuned ear towards the language. And this is a 5,000-year-old continuous written tradition, by comparison with which English is a footnote on the rear end of the history of civilization, right? When we speak English, we're speaking something that's something kind of just like an after-dinner drink compared to Chinese, right? And you can go back to the Palace Museum in Taipei, and you can look at Qing Dynasty and earlier inscriptions and see writing that bears a strong resemblance to written characters that you see today. And these are millennia old, right? Ang really knows that tradition. He's got an amazing ear for language. And Chinese is, at its deepest and most emotional, expresses itself in ways that are in many ways fundamentally different from the way we speak in America. We tend to just kind of let each other know, or we pretend that we let each other know what's going on. That's our way of lying to each other, right? Chinese is quite different. So there were really specific moments in the movie where in the script I would write things like, I have always loved you. which is more or less a laugh line in Chinese if you were to translate that directly. And it was a great experience to learn how to take the bluntness, the blunt instrument of what I call international subtitle style of writing, which at the end of the day is what we wanted to have. We wanted a film that would have an accessibility to audiences around the world, even though it was going to be subtitled, but to take that baseline and then find Eng developing it into something more.
受你委托是我这辈子最得意的一件事。嘿，因为这几年是你在教我武当剑法心诀吗？幸亏你识字不多。
So how did you interface with the original pulp novel material? Was that something Ang just sort of described to you in terms of what he wanted to keep and what he didn't?
Yeah, the novel had never been translated fully into English, so it was not within our means nor within our timeline for me to take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of wuxia writing in Chinese and get it translated and work through it. But we did get a very, very lengthy précis. Scores and scores of pages, probably about 100 pages. And I worked through that, as well as obviously with my co-writers who had already begun to shape some of the screenplay.
And how did your interaction with them work, especially with them, because you're scripting and part of what they're doing is translating that into Mandarin, both literally and, as you say, sort of conceptually.
Yeah. I mean, as always, and I've had the great experience of co-writing on a number of Eng's movies that are Chinese language. It's a little bit of ping pong. So, you hit the ball over the net and then you wait an inordinate amount of time and the ball comes back, but it's a different ball. And then you grab it, look at it, break it down, rewrite it, send it back and forth you go. And oftentimes translation does not work in your favor. There's miscommunication, there's misunderstanding, there's frustration. Like, wait a second, what happened to that great scene? That kind of thing. And other times there's these amazing surprises when you see something that you kind of gave an initial impetus to, and then you see it transformed and lifted by its placement in a culture and you understand that you might have thought of something really cool, but even you didn't know the real meaning of it. Somebody picked it up and found another place for it that made it resonate even more.
You've lectured about that, the attempt to appeal to international audiences, the attempt to make films that can play around the world. And you've said that if this film was made today, the studio would want something that was more aimed at like 20-something Chinese audiences and that would remove all of the emotional resonance. I mean, why would it be necessary to remove the emotional resonance for audiences? What do you think those audiences are looking for?
I think there are two things going on. So I think you're taking two different quotations and putting them together, so I'll break them apart for you. One is the Hollywood studio system now, today, we're talking about so-called American movies, Hollywood movies. Really, the brass ring really is the youth audience in China. It's the fastest growing movie-going audience in the world, and it's the only movie-going audience in the world that is getting younger every year, not older, which is a good thing. So I'm all for this audience. I like 20-year-old Chinese audiences, and I think that they are driving a really interesting new energy into international filmmaking. And oftentimes, in fact, they require and ask for a more intense emotional experience than what American audiences tend to go for. Often you'll see in the biggest Chinese movies that are out there today, a lot of hearts on sleeves. They're unabashedly emotional and romantic and exciting and fun. And I think we should watch that space. I think the future of mainstream global cinema probably lies in a new inflection that's coming out of China and coming out of these new filmmakers out of China right now. So I'm all for that.
Okay.
What I'm not for necessarily is the idea that in order to make a movie for a global audience, you have to make a pastiche that eventually takes flavors from every menu around the world and creates some kind of gloppy, goopy mess that you put into a cinematic NutriBullet and force feed down people's throats. To me, I still believe that there is a kind of authenticity that comes from when filmmakers like Ang Lee get to return to their cultures, mine their cultures for storytelling and narrative traditions and visual traditions, stick to a plan of attack that has a genuine fidelity to those traditions, but that is speaking to other people. So instead of trying to speak for or on behalf or in the name of or in the voice of everybody, keep your own voice, keep your own traditions, keep your own cinematic styles, But if you're thinking about other audiences, understand that if you do a pretty good job of finding a space within the kind of global cultural context, other people might start listening to you.
So do you think if you wrote Crouching Tiger today, it would look markedly different? Or is it because it's so much in your voice, it would come out the same?
You know, I hope that the film isn't in my voice. I hope it's in a voice that I was able to lend to Ang, you know. So, and I think that's really an important part of screenwriting. It's a very, at least for me, it's a medium that's very instrumental. And so, for example, the last time you went to the movies and saw a terrible movie, you didn't walk out of the theater and say, that was a terrible movie, but the screenplay was fantastic. Right? What a voice in that script. It was amazing. You never say that. The whole point of a good screenplay is to get you out of that space of the page and onto the screen, and only directors and crews and actors can do that. So to a certain extent, with the task at hand 15 years later, if we were to revisit Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, it might well be quite different, or it might well be absolutely the same. I do feel as if the film, in marrying a narrative that is essentially female-centric, essentially really follows the journey of a heroine who's excluded by the structures of the culture and of the tradition to find herself, and for her to battle her way into and through that, and then find freedom from it at the end, is a narrative that still seems to be 15 years later pretty, shall we say, contemporary.
It is. I mean, it feels like only right now we're in a moment where people are focusing more on heroines and how they interact with heroes and what's to be said about female characters that's meaningful. Why was that so important to you guys at the time? Do you have a sense of like where that idea came from, that you wanted to bring women more into martial arts?
I think the idea for that central female character certainly is derived from the book. Why Ang chose that book as the one that he was going to bring to the world in his first chop sake movie, I mean, that's the question. And I think for Ang, that outsider voice and vision, that underdog, that alternative to the politics of patriarchy and the control, but still, as you can see from the film is a constant dialogue about authority and teaching and mastery and masculinity versus femininity, and then how the two things don't end up not being in opposition, finding a way to cohabit and then create something new. I think that's been one of Ang's great themes throughout his entire career.
What surprised you about the reaction to the movie? I mean, were there things that you expected to work or not work that people reacted in ways you weren't expecting?
You know, I was surprised at the intensity of the response to the fights from an emotional point of view. When we screened the film for the first time to the public at Cannes, and after the first fight, there was almost a standing ovation. People were just so excited. They just didn't expect that level of just lift from it. And it was so gratifying. You know, the other thing is that I learned a lot about contemporary movie audiences, and in particular for foreign language films. And a lot of cliches got exploded in the release of this film. Go back and look at the top 10 foreign language hits in the history of America. And you will find that in that top 10, a large cluster, in fact, probably the most notable cluster, are chop sake movies, right? Iron Monkey or Hero or Crouching Tiger, etc. And you will also note that one of the major driving forces behind the success of those films are African-American men. And so when you think, after you hear this, of the primary audience in America for foreign language films, think of that African-American guy. Because he's watching movies, he doesn't care that they're subtitled, he wants to see a good movie. You know, foreign language films only get 1% to 2% of the box office every year in this country. And in fact, it turns out that if you're looking for cross-cultural expertise, you can go no further than Staten Island, which is where we went 15 years ago when the film was released, and found Wu-Tang Clan, you know, the rap group, and screened the film for those guys, because of course in the movie Wu-Don Mountain, Wu-Tang, right? These guys had an incredible knowledge of the culture, right? So it was really fun to connect with audiences that the dominant culture really dismisses as, oh, well, they would never go for this kind of thing. It turns out they were one of the great gifts to the movie.
Huh. So it seems very clear, just if you watch art house movie theaters after Crouching Tiger, there was a wave of other films getting imported. I'm curious whether you think there have been more like lasting impacts, either on the culture or just on martial art fans.
I think that within martial arts culture, Crouching Tiger was an intervention in the sense that it moved from the earlier dominant styles, what would be called Southern Fist, the kind of Bruce Lee, right, this kind of thing, variations on this thing, to Northern Leg, right? There's the floating and the Qigong. There's all that kind of style that really had some great exponents in the 60s, but then drifted away a little bit, fell into a bit more disrepute. And so I do think that Crouching Tiger really allowed for a more balletic, more dance-oriented, more nimble kind of approach to martial arts than you had seen before. And you've seen that picked up by filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai and others, who I wouldn't say are imitating in any way what Aang did, but certainly I think they found a space to explore that Crouching Tiger probably helped clear.
There's also just the way, I mean, it was nominated for so many Oscars, which was, including Best Picture and Best Director, which was just almost unheard of at the time for a foreign language film. Do you think it opened the door for foreign language films as people kind of saw, there's more out there, like nothing against Pushing Hands, but that kind of film isn't the end all and be all of what foreign films can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't believe that Crouching Tiger really opened that many doors in terms of the general cultural acceptance for foreign language cinema. And the statistics, I think, back me up. It just is what it is. Americans remain a primarily parochial and inward-looking people, in that they're not that much different from a lot of other people. But then again, if you are part of a culture that's not that big, or a country with a language that doesn't cross that many boundaries, you're of necessity going to be consuming more culture from outside your own country. That makes you automatically a bit more cosmopolitan. We have the luxury of just having a lot of people speaking English and a big movie, and television industry to cater to us. So I don't think it's had a deep structural resonance within things like the Academy in and of itself. That said, Hollywood has always kind of brought in foreign filmmakers, the Germans in the 30s, and especially the Jewish immigrants. And if you look back, there's these waves in which Hollywood has taken in foreign filmmakers. Think about this. Ingmar Bergman was making movies for Roger Corman back in the 70s, right? That's kind of crazy to think, isn't it?
That is pretty crazy.
But it is true that there have always been these connections, even at that level with foreign cinema. And I think they come and they go. So you've seen, Life is Beautiful came. There's a whole bunch of films that will find their way from time to time within that Oscar landscape. And of course, just most recently, The Artist, for example. So did the artist winning change anything? No. Nobody's seen any movies by those filmmakers here in America since, right? It's kind of weird. It's like they only made one movie? Huh? What? Why aren't we watching all their other movies? It doesn't happen, does it?
Getting away from, I guess, the legacy for Hollywood or for cinema or for art house theaters, what about the legacy of the film for itself? What do you think there is about it that makes people keep coming back to it or makes it appropriate, for audiences 15 years later who are just discovering it and falling in love with it?
Yeah. I think I do think that Hollywood more or less gave up on that kind of old-fashioned, epic, romantic, big entertainment. The kind of the David Lean movie, movies with a certain kind of emotional ambition. And we've become pretty formulaic, and those formulas are often awesome. But the one thing you can say about those movies is they tend not to reach the same level of epic emotional resonance as some of the earlier Hollywood films. But in general, it's not a Hollywood thing. And there's always going to be a place for movies that you can put in and be transported to another time and place, and yet completely relate to emotions that are far more broad and epic and big and overreaching and profound than you tend to run into in your normal course of your working day.
It just sounds like so much philosophy went into the film in terms of what you want to communicate about culture and who these films belong to, what you want to communicate about women and action, what you want to communicate about like emotion and feeling. Was all of this conscious? Did you sit down with Eng and have long conversations about this, or did it just sort of come out in the process of writing?
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the tough things about working with Eng is that he works 20 hours a day on the movie, every aspect, every detail. He questions every line of dialogue you write. He questions every decision you make about, as a screenwriter, producer, whatever. And then when that's over, it's time to sit down and talk about the philosophy of the movie. And really, at that point, no, it's time to go to bed. But he has a very strong appetite for wanting to hear the answer to the question, why? And if he doesn't feel confident that there is an answer forthcoming as to why we're doing what we're doing, he won't do it. So it's a pretty high bar that you got to get over to get Eng's attention. I think Eng and I have had the working relationship we had for over a quarter of a century, probably because at heart we share the same finicky, oddball, research mania, desire to kind of keep learning and keep knowing, and knowing that we won't ever really know and won't ever have a complete and total control over the process. But the appetite for that is certainly something that bonds us, for sure. It's annoying. But, yeah, we keep going.